And I got my brother here.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back.
We are the Pinedo Brothers, Catholic filmmaking brothers. And as we follow our muse of um, revitalizing the world of Catholic art, we're also speaking as conservatives and artist creatives that want to have a voice for free artistic expression. So we have kind of a little, a smaller niche, and we're glad that you found us if you're just now tuning into this podcast. So welcome if that's the case, and welcome back if you're one of our older listeners. Today we're talking about the Catholic Church. We're talking as Catholics. We have a very vested interest in this. Specifically, I wanted to ask Peter the question of, is the Catholic Church relevant anymore? And lend our Catholic Artist point of view, POV, to that. So this is really brought into focus, into very direct focus, because of the story that broke this past weekend about Bishop Strickland. Bishop Strickland is the bishop of the Archdiocese of Tyler, Texas, so basically a neighbor of mine, um, or uh, his his flock is our neighbors of mine, and um, he the story broke is that Pope Francis and um, authorities from the Vatican are requesting his resignation, asking him to step down, which of course is causing quite an uproar with especially people of Tyler, but people of Texas, people of the United States who see Bishop Strickland as actually a rather young for a bishop. He's 64, as a young, vibrant voice speaking for orthodoxy in the church amongst the hierarchy. So this is a lot of surprise, consternation going on. Um, and so what I really wanted to get a sense of, well, first of all, did I surmise that story accurately, Peter? You have an insider's view as a journalist.
Yeah, so pretty accurate. He's with the Diocese of Tyler, not Archdiocese, but for anyone who's not Catholic, that's not really doesn't make a difference. Um, but as far you might know more than me, but as far as I know, I don't think that they have officially requested that he resign. But that they are supposedly in talks about and heavily considering asking him to resign. I was reading from a couple of news sources that named inside sources that were, well, they didn't name them. They said they were citing inside sources for the story that they didn't name, and so that to me really calls things into doubt about their full authenticity, because normally, if you're really gonna go full in on what you're saying, you're gonna put your name on it. But yeah, that's the situation. That he's I think him the Bishop of Tyler, Strickland, has been definitely um, a solid voice for, or definitely a strong pro-life voice here in Texas, and definitely an advocate for tradition in many ways. Very artistic in the way that he presents the faith. Him and I think Archbishop Cordialone of San Francisco have kind of been the leaders of that kind of more traditional camp, I would say. But yeah, you surmised it pretty accurately.
Great. No, thanks for clarifying a few points. That's very helpful. So what I see here is kind of a longish pattern of um, anti-pastoral type of activity. And by anti-pastoral, I mean a complete disconnect from, at least from my limited perception, of the church hierarchy with the rank and file people in the pews, um, with notable exceptions like the Bishop of Tyler and Archbishop Cordialone. Uh, so, and then other exceptions from within the a little bit less high up the chain of the church hierarchy. So I guess what I see what I mean by other pattern by a pattern of other things going on like this are when you go into a church Let me take an example of a trip that I had to the Diocese of Chicago. I was doing a business trip to Chicago last month, and for Sunday Mass, the closest church, the one I could walk to, was the cathedral. And I walked into this incredible cathedral, and the first thing that I saw when I walked in was just I was struck by how beautiful it was. And then I got struck by how the cathedral was at war with itself. It was amazing. Have you ever seen the Cathedral of Chicago, Peter?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. So it's a beautiful place, but it has this timeless beauty that was made in the it was constructed in the 1800s. I think it was 1860s, and um, it has these moments where it just completely clashes because it has the Gothic style from its foundations, and then it has these weird modernist and brutalistic, um, expressionistic is a better term, expressionistic art in moments. So, for example, they took out all the stained glass and put in abstract art for the stained glass, and then they hollowed out the whole back behind the tabernacle so that it was completely bare. And then they moved the tabernacle over to the left side, and it was an odd, like, globe sort of structure where there was this kind of spidery legs extending out from the tabernacle. And then in the back of the church, it was that same sort of theme where it was like billowing type of smoke structure that was amorphous and gray. You couldn't really, I couldn't really understand like what exactly is going on here. So it was very expressionistic. When I mean that, it was just it's odd. It makes you be like,
Mhm.
this is something that can't quite put my finger on it, but it's not quite what it is. Um, and the church, even though it was Sunday in the middle of the day, was completely empty. It was, well, not completely empty. I was there, and there was a few other people there, but the pews were more empty than full. And there was just this sense that it was completely out of touch with what was going on in the church in the day. There was no children, a huge contrast from where I generally attend Sunday church, which is a cacophony of of sound and babies crying. This one had zero children, and you could tell that there was no chance that they were ever going to be attracting children and families with children by the prayers of the faithful alone, which were full of talking about the uh, uh, praying for uh, succor from the climate gods that they might not that the climate might not burn us all in eternal flames. And it was also a really odd point, something I'd never heard before, where they um, requested that Pope Francis be given a long life and good health because so that he might continue his all important ministry. And I was like, oh wow, this I've everyone in Catholic Church prays for the Pope generally, but I've never heard it put in that way. So it was a very interesting way of putting it. And the longer I sat there, I began to kind of deviate. My thoughts deviated from God and deviated from what the foundations of this cathedral were meant to do, which is elevate my minds to God and think about how this was a dying parish in the middle of Chicago, in the middle of a huge archdiocese. That one would be an archdiocese. Um, and it's completely without life. There's I like the phrase saying where when you're not crying, you're dying. And that was the case. They were dying. And you see that with a lot of parishes here in Houston as well, where there's parishes that are just dying and they have no chance of getting people back because they're not preaching anything that has meat or merit. So what's the good of having this parish anymore if no one's going there because there's nothing of substance to offer. I start to wonder, is the church hierarchy, um, what is it focused on now, where so many of these parishes just seem to be kind of completely lost the way? Not all of them, not all of them. You always find, with everywhere you go, a good parish to attend, but it's the exception. It's not the norm, and that's where I start to wonder, like, what's happening here? What do you
Mm.
make of that, Peter?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First off, so you would say that the parishes in Houston are kind of more, or there's a lot of empty ones? Because in my that's not my experience. In mine, I've been impressed by how full pretty much every parish I've been to in Houston is, as opposed to somewhere like Washington D.C., where even the more well-populated parishes are a lot more empty than what I would see in a less populated parish in Houston. So maybe I'm
You're
just what's that?
Yeah. Yeah, you're right that Houston is more full than most parishes. That's absolutely right. And I would also say that there's generally a pretty direct correlation between being full in Houston and being a rather Orthodox parish. Um, but when we first moved back to Houston from LA, we did a lot of parish shopping, like you know. And there were a lot of empty parishes. Or not completely empty, but more empty than not. Um, so I don't know what the ratio is, but you're right.
Mhm,
Houston is definitely an exception from other cities that I've gone to that it's more full. But I don't think it's the norm. I
mhm,
think more cities are like DC than like Houston, although I don't have the data at my fingertips. But you're right.
right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, we definitely in, the church today, I think we are struggling with many things, and I think one of the big ones is that, um, we are getting a lot of what we get in the secular world in the church, and that's politics. We're getting tons and tons of politics, and we're hearing about, all there's one thing to talk about all the scandals and everything that have happened, and then on top of that, we're having the infighting of the church hierarchy and all that, and that's, I think, creates a very uh, a world that's not conducive to the faith flourishing. I think that makes it very difficult. The thing you mentioned with Bishop Strickland, is another example of internal politics that is causing a lot of scandal, I think, to the faithful. They see a good faithful leader in Bishop Strickland, and the fact that the possibility of the Vatican asking him to resign. That's difficult to understand. Of course, like I see it in a couple of different ways. I think Bishop Strickland, he does make a lot of odd comments and stuff on Twitter, and things that you wouldn't really expect a bishop to say, on Twitter. But at the same time, he's a lot more solid of a bishop than a lot of the ones that are oftentimes commended. So it's confusing. I think it can be very frustrating for the Catholics. But in terms of um, whether the church is relevant or not, I don't. I think the thing to remember definitely is that the hierarchy doesn't define the church. And oftentimes we look to see the the Pope as the face of the church, but truly the face of the church is crucified Christ. And the heart of the church is the Eucharist, and those things haven't changed at all. But I think it's all it what like as artists, we definitely have to think of what kind of message are we sending, what kind of image are we portraying, because that's what art is about. And oftentimes we're sending one that is not going to resonate, and that maybe you could make an argument, I think, that the message that we're sending and the image we're portraying has no future, and it's not relevant in today's culture.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, I think there's two sides to this story about whether or not we're relevant. There is, are we relevant? Is the church relevant to the people that attend it in the pews? Like, is it relevant to our lives? Does it nourish us? Does it bring us closer to God? Does it help us in the imitation of Christ that we're called to pursue? Um, and if it, I think that's the first step. I think that's very crucial. You need to be able to minister to the people in the pews.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, the hierarchy is definitely casting a very confusing. It's an anti-pastoral focus. It's more political, like you said. It's a lack of pastoral care. Um, but you're right that that's not the church isn't defined by the hierarchy. Um, Ultimately, the church is defined by Christ, which is the bride. Is the church is His bride.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it relevant to us in the pews? Well, yes, because Christ is always relevant. Um, Now, despite the best efforts of the hierarchy, it reminds me of a famous quote where I think Napoleon told a bishop or a pope that he was going to bring about the downfall of the Catholic Church. And the Pope replied back, "Good luck. We've been trying to do that, us bishops in Rome, for many centuries and haven't been able to do it yet." So it's nothing new, I suppose, that um, we we lack for a pastoral focus at the top. Although I think we have been spoiled by two very pastoral bishops of Rome, and Benedict and Pope John Paul the Great, Pope Saint John Paul the Great. Um, so whenever you have a saint, you're bound to be spoiled, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose, which is a good thing. Um, so that's the first step. So I think there's arguments on both sides there. Ultimately, yes, the church is relevant to us in the pews. On the other side, there is what you brought up right now, which is the church relevant to those? Does the church reach out beyond the pews in a relevant way? Um, and I think ultimately, there the hierarchy fails in that regard as well. At least, as a norm, it fails because of all these confusion. Political messages are no good for those beyond the pews either. But us as the laity, the church militant, so to speak, um, we have the we have the great obligation to continue on, to to push forward, to reach beyond the pews ourselves. And as artists, we have a great way, a great medium for us to do that, to reach beyond the pews. So that leads me to the second question, which is, what kind of Catholic art have we seen recently? What kind of I spoke a little bit of architecture. It seems like we've really lost the thread when it comes to church architecture, although there are um, some great exceptions that are cropping up, and even within our own parish, I'd love to see them. Like Christ the Redeemer is a great modern, beautiful church that's been built regularly here in Houston. So, what about movies? What about other types of Catholic art? Have you been? What's the status of that in your mind?
Mm-hmm. No, I think when you're talking about movies, I think that our representation is abysmal. We really don't have anything to speak of. I think that the Protestants have surpassed us, by leaps and bounds, by leagues. And but even their films are always, in pretty much everyone I can think of, is very still very much within the idea of being within the church, not going without, not saying a message that will resound with anyone outside of the pews. I think perhaps an exception to that in the film world would be Sound of Freedom, since that came out this year, and that was made by Catholics, and that really became very much of a cultural phenomenon there. Um, but kind of coming from a filmmaker's perspective, I mean, we don't, as Catholic filmmakers, we don't want to bash anyone who's doing um, good work in the film industry. But you watch something like that, And as I think as an artist, you kind of think, you're like, is this the best we can do? This is not. I feel like this can't be the best that we can do. We can do a lot better.
Yeah.
Um, and so when it comes to film, I like you said, when it comes to other things like the churches, I think that there's been a little bit of a revival there. We're seeing a bit more. I've started to notice a few good Catholic artists. Again, nothing that compares, comes close to comparing to the great works of the Renaissance and the medieval ages. But I think there is some movement there, some cause for hope. But when it comes to film, we're nowhere near where we should be.
Right. Well, when it comes to film and it comes to Catholic film in particular, there's two directors that I like to point to. And they don't make films every year, sadly. I wish they had the regularity of a Chris Nolan sort of thing, who doesn't make it every year, but every other year it feels like there's a Nolan flick coming out, which is great. I love that. But I wouldn't classify Nolan as a Catholic director. I mean, he's a good director, a great director, I would say, but not Catholic. Doesn't really make Catholic art. Um,
Is
on
he
the other,
Catholic?
but I don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if he is, but I don't know. Um, the two that I know are Catholic, and I would call them as making Catholic art, would be old Mel Gibson, who every film that he directs is a tour de force of filmic prowess. So, and it's great examples of Catholic art. I mean, he's not a Catholic in that he's unified with the larger Catholic world. Unfortunately, he's one of the splinter Catholics, but we still count him. We still definitely want him. um, so, for example, the latest Hacksaw Ridge that he had was just
Yeah, I actually
he
watched
had.
that recently for the first time,
Yeah,
and
well, that
that
scene.
was
Go ahead.
incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, it is incredible, and the scene he's got a literal baptism scene where he's washing the blood of soldiers off. That the main character is washing blood of soldiers off of him in battle after a battle, and it is baptism. Um, and Mel knows what he's doing when he does that. So all of his films have examples of Catholic art within them. The other one that I'd like to point to is Terrence Malick. Um, Malick is not quite as overtly religious. At times, he's even more religious than Mel, actually, now that I think about it. Like, for example, Tree of Life is very religious. Um, and he produces films with more regularity than Mel does. They're sometimes a little hard to understand. Actually, they're always hard to understand, but that doesn't mean they're not excellent examples of art and Catholic art. I think the best one you can point to is A Hidden Life, where it's the story about, and we've spoken about this in the podcast past, where it's the story about um, a man living in Austria who refuses to join the German army and gets executed for it. Um, the whole idea is this hidden act of love that no one appreciates is of utmost importance. So that is those two are examples of Catholic art that are out there. But the problem that I see when it comes to Catholic art in movies is a, I'm not sure. It seems like the Catholics that are in positions to fund art in movies aren't really invested in doing that. Um, I can't think of a Catholic that I know that would invest in a Mel Gibson movie or a Terrence Malick movie. It doesn't seem to be something that happens. I do know of Catholic investors that would invest in films like the one that Alejandro Monteverde makes. So he was the one who directed The Sound of Freedom. He also directed Bella. And I was very curious about seeing how they managed to get that funded. I don't know the inside story. I have gotten lunch with one of the producers, who one of the executive producers on the film, and I actually texted him, but he was probably pretty busy. Didn't get a chance to reply to my text, but it'd be great to pick his brain about how they managed to do that with Sound of Freedom, and if it was Catholics that actually funded it. I would assume not. by the fact that he had such a hard time making this film. I think he had to, and he already has contacts with the whole Catholic world. I think they probably had to reach outside of Catholic investors to make this happen. Otherwise, if Catholic investors wanted to do it, they would have done it a lot faster. And ultimately, they got finishing funds from um, Angel Studios, which would be, I would classify that as Mormon investors.
Mhm.
So, definitely seems like a difficult nut to crack when it comes to more established Catholics who are in positions to invest in films are hesitant to, it seems, invest in directors who are art centric instead of, message centric.
Mhm.
Maybe we've been infected a little bit by the Protestant sort of, um, what is the word, sola scriptura, where it's that has to be a little bit more preachy because it is without the symbols. Sola scriptura is the idea that all you can rely upon is the word. All you can rely upon is the written word of Christ. So I wonder if that's something that older Catholics have to deal with that maybe younger Catholics don't have, because it's not the same sort. They're not the same sort at all. What do you think?
Well, I think in many ways we're stuck in a mode of looking backward. And I think we kind of we touched on this in maybe last episode of the podcast, that we're um, Catholics in many ways are oftentimes looking back at the age in which the church was thriving, or in their eyes it was thriving. And um, I think from what I've seen, um, the Catholics who would be able to fund projects like that are not looking for new ways to move forward, but are instead looking for ways to go back. And I think that is in many ways the problem. Um, Films like Hacksaw Ridge and the Meaning of Life one, what was that one called?
A, a hidden life, a hidden life.
Life. Yes. I think that speaks to on so much of a deeper level that people are hungry to hear from. But we're really having a crisis of when it a crisis of identity and what we want to message. Um, and I'm not really sure exactly what the solution to that can be. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't have the solution, but I have one point of hope that I wanted to point to, which is the Catholic and conservative movements in America. So we're Catholic, we're conservative, we're artists. It's kind of a small group. However, the Catholic conservative, oh, and we're also Hispanic, which is important. We check a lot of interesting little boxes. Um, and I think that the hope for the Catholic conservative movement is really the Hispanics who are becoming more and more. The Catholics, for some odd reason, generally don't vote conservative. However, um, Hispanics that come to this country are socially conservative, not generally fiscally conservative, but socially conservative, meaning that they're pro traditional marriage, fiscally conservative in that they're pro free market. So I guess they're both fiscal and socially conservative because they often know the horrors that come from socialism. Um, and you're seeing that they're beginning to vote more and more conservative as things begin to get crazier and crazier here in this country. Hopefully, they don't get too crazy, but we'll see. We'll always find out. That's one thing that we know for certain that the future will happen. So my sense is that there is a bit of a synergy when it comes to creating content for the socially conservative Latinos, the socially conservative Hispanics that are Catholics, um, and the younger conservative Catholics, because there's not any content for them. For example, pretty much every single Hispanic or Spanish language uh, TV station is completely liberal. And so if you're socially conservative, you really don't have that point of connection. Um, so I think what the point that we have to make here is money. Maybe we don't have to pitch to people who are values aligned. Maybe we need to be pitching to people who are wanting to make money, because there's a huge amount of money to be made by looking at these underserved audiences and saying we can reach them. Um, and I think the synergy of that, younger, conservative, uh, socially conservative, it's important, free markets, pro America, those sort of things are, there's plenty of fruit ripe to be picked. So I
Hmm.
think what I would reply as far as point of hope is maybe we appeal to baser instincts, people who just want to make money. What do you think?
Hmm. Well, I mean, it's true. If you look at what's succeeding, things like Public Square, Michael Seifert, and what he's doing, he is basically creating a parallel economy for people who are pro-life, pro-America, and it's succeeding massively. I think it's doing it. It's doing really well. Just having just started, it's already expected to become very profitable very soon. Um, and what that is just it's businesses, and it's people who are in the market to make money and who are appealing to people who appealing from an economic standpoint of um, an audience or a customer base that is tired of being stepped on and looked over. And you just kind of look at how successful multiple different boycotts have been recently, and you're seeing that there is a frustration in the marketplace, and people are starting to voice their frustrations. Um, so I think if we can figure out the way to really be able to connect with that customer base, that audience, um, which again is something that as Catholics and even as the pro-life movement has completely failed to do utterly and terribly. I mean, so many conservatives and Republicans think that the abortion is a losing issue at this point, and it's crazy because you have leftists who are advocating for abortion up until after birth. And then here we think that, oh, we can't, talk about our 6 week abortion ban because that's too extreme. Um, and that just kind of really indicates a complete failure on the cultural level to actually communicate our our values. We're not communicating clearly, and I think that um, if we can connect with that wider audience, just based on the level of we can make you money. We're in the business to make money, and we're not here to step on you on your beliefs. Um, I think we would very quickly be able to communicate a message that will resound very strongly with people.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, very encouraging. This is good stuff. I'm sorry, folks, we started a little later, so we probably ought to be wrapping it up. But we wanted to finish up before we go with a quick cultural take. Peter and I were chatting about Oliver Anthony and Richmond, north of Richmond. I almost said south for some reason. Richmond, north of Richmond. Um, and I was actually listening to him on the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, where he was talking about having a vision for the future and how Peterson was able to give him a help to help him from a time where he was feeling suicidal by his self-authoring program, which I also took. Um, the self-authoring program also helped me back, before I was married, before I had kids, and being able to visualize where I wanted to go in the future. Um, And you can kind of see that in his work where he knows what he wants to do. So he says no to a lot of things. And he's trying right now that his voice has gotten out there, to just continue to speak to that own little unique voice that he's made, which has become blasted out into the stratosphere. So I think it's a great story. I'm very interested in it. What is your take on Oliver Anthony, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, obviously his song became huge, and it's itself, it's a very to me, it struck me as a very bitter song, very backward looking, which, I hear that, I'm like, I'm not really a big fan of that, but it definitely resonated with so many people because it voiced those frustrations.
Right.
What I've been more impressed with him than his song was the messaging that he's had since becoming, or since getting noticed. When he was on the Joe Rogan show and he was reading scripture to Joe Rogan, and he was just reading from the Bible, and it was blowing Joe Rogan's mind. He was like, "Oh my gosh, like that's what the Bible says? That's really awesome. Like I agree with that." And Joe Rogan probably wouldn't have cracked open a Bible to discover it himself, but here he's using this platform in this moment that he has, however long it will last, to cast a vision for the future, like you were saying, and to evangelize in a way that um, will actually be understood by the people he's talking to. So I think that's awesome. He his kind of thing reminds me a little bit of a music festival I just recently went to, called the Appaloosa Music Festival, and it was in the Appalachian Mountains over in Northern Virginia. And it's not a Catholic or Christian event officially, but it's put on by some Catholic brothers, which is pretty cool, who are in a folk band, and they put it on, and it's attracting people from across the country to come and spend a weekend listening to folk and country music. Not because it's overtly a religious thing, but because it kind of portrays something different. It's sending a vision for the future that's hopeful and joyful. And I think that, um, well, one, we want to collaborate with those people sometime in the future, and two, it's giving us lots of cause for hope, and kind of tying it back in together to what the original topic was, is that it's making the church relevant again. It's going outside the walls of the church and actually preaching a message of hope that's not mired down in politics and um, inside fighting, but just purely communicating the joy of God in His creation. So, all really great things.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, that's the. It doesn't even have to communicate joy. It can communicate sorrow, which is what Oliver Anthony, or frustration, or
Mhm.
anger,
Well, I
or
think even that, communicating truthfully about
right,
sorrow is a
right.
message of joy as well. Because if you have sorrow for something, that's indicating the existence of a truth, of a true joy. I mean, you listen to a lot of the pop music that we hear today, and it's not really communicating sadness or joy, because it's kind of just saying that everything's all the same. Everything is kind of mediocre in the end.
Mm,
So I think a real good sorrowful song is gonna point to joy as well.
that's great. Great point. Okay, well, I know that we're running a bit long, so we probably ought to end it here. But Pete, did you have any other further points?
I think this has been fun, so thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you. And we'll see you all next time here on the Pinedo Brothers Podcast.